The McIlvaney Weekly Commentary, covering monetary, economic, and geopolitical news events. Now, here are Kevin Orrick and David McIlvaney.
Welcome to the McIlvaney Weekly Commentary. I'm Kevin Orrick along with David McIlvaney. David, I'm talking to you, as we promised today, while you're in Berlin. And, of course, that's where the Reichstag is. That's where so much world history has changed. And, you know, even today with what's going on with the Greek and the Portuguese and the Spanish problems, the debt of the southern countries versus the ideology of the northern countries, you know, it seems to me like this is a city of crisis. In other words, we had the crisis of World War II. We've had crisis of World War I. We now have the crisis of the integration and the consolidation of power of Europe. Are you feeling it while you're there?
Well, Kevin, I'm reminded of that attitude expressed by Rahm Emanuel several years ago, which was that you should never let a crisis go to waste. And
right.
There is this idea that government grows in fits and starts, that there is sort of crisis intervention, so to say, and that's when the state apparatus tends to surge. And that's what we wanted to look at today, Kevin, because in Berlin you've got really a consolidation of power through financial obligation,
right,
becoming more and more the creditor in what you might describe as a control position. And much has been, as the EU has come together, the Eurozone has come together, rather, much has been ceded voluntarily, and much will likely be given to this idea of a stabilized Eurozone. But, of course, who will ultimately guarantee, and this is sort of a financial guarantee, quote unquote, it's the ECB, the European Central Bank, and who is the real muscle behind the ECB? It's the German National Bank. So, Kevin, you have these voluntary ties which are being made, voluntary commitments and dependencies which have been crafted. And now under stress, countries will have to meet certain conditions in order to continue to receive bailout dollars.
Well, David, I think about those conditions that they're now having to meet. This was the fear back in the 1990s, even when they were talking about this in the late 80s, this unification of Europe. The fear was that countries would give up sovereignty or be controlled by one entity. And you know, the other fear was that Germany has been the entity of control really since the 1870s.
Kevin, there's another issue, and you've seen this with Spain in recent weeks and with Holland more recently. And there is the idea, or the contrast rather, between we can't meet the fiscal expectations of the Eurozone, and then there's a new language, which is we won't meet the fiscal expectations of the Eurozone.
Right.
So, again, you have strings attached in some instances, and there's not really a quid pro quo, but sort of an assumption of leadership and perhaps an expectation of payback. And I think it would be good to remember, just in the extreme, what happens in these sovereign debt crises. And if you go back to Newfoundland, this is, of course, many decades ago, where the debts were impossible to pay back, and the British simply annexed the country. In other words, it became a part of Canada. They lost their sovereignty to the British. And again, this is Newfoundland basically saying, we'll never pay it back. I guess you'll have to take the productive capacity and potential tax revenues of the country. And again, it just became a part of Canada.
Well, and David, I'd like to look at it from a different view. I'd like to look at it from the German view for a moment. Okay, we talk about these other countries who were worried about losing their sovereignty to maybe one entity ruling. But the German people were not unanimously excited about the EU either. I mean, if you think about it, this is a country that had been through multiple hyperinflations, at least 2 hyperinflations in the 20th century, plus several wars. They had seen what happens with the overexpansion or taking on of debt that they can't pay off and have to print money to get their way out. I mean, there was a sacrifice, was there not, when the Germans also entered the EU?
Well, that's right. If you recall that for the EMU system, the European Monetary Unit system, for that to be launched successfully, Germany had to give up the Deutschmark.
Right.
And that's a particularly touchy subject because for a country with a history of hyperinflation or radical currency mismanagement going back to the 1919 to 1924 period under Havenstein, the central banker at the time, to give up their currency was no small sacrifice because the Deutschmark had become something very solid, very trusted in the wake of that hyperinflation. So it took many decades to sort of build security within the system, the monetary system, and they didn't really want to move away from that. So this transition to the euro caused initially a pretty significant rise in prices here in Germany, That's not an issue, I suppose, if you're in the upper crust, but for the poor and the middle class, there was initially some resentment in terms of what appeared to be price inflation right at the outset of adopting the euro. So I think often the primary issue that Europeans look to in favor of the euro is that it is convenient. There's ease of convertibility in cross-border transactions. With travel, moving back and forth between countries with a shrunken geography, and it's very easy to forget this in the United States, but with the shrunken geography on the continent, you have much more cause, much more reason to be going from one country to the next. And so that convenience factor is really a useful thing.
Well, added to convenience, though, David, it is more convenient. As you know, right now you're in Germany, but you're probably traveling amongst multiple countries. If you travel over to Belgium or drop down into France, each time you would have to change your currency or go to any other country. It's more convenient. But you've got old tensions, David, that go back. I mean, there are some hard feelings that go back even to World War II between Greece and Germany. That's part of the issue right now.
It is that the Deutschmark imprimatur was the legitimizer of the new currency, the euro. I mean, that there was an integrity that came with the Deutschmark, and the euro by proxy was legitimized by that solidity, that stability. And this is really something, again, that we were saying just a moment ago, was developed in the post-World War II period. Mm-hmm. And not to labor the point on this, but the tensions between Greece and Germany over fiscal stability, and that tends to open an old wound, one that goes back to World War II, where when Germany was occupying Greece, Germany took over the Greek central bank and controlled the Greek money supply. And at that time, the Germans caused a domestic super or hyperinflation in Greece. This is, again, World War II. And so the consequences of that still lingers in the minds of the older generation. So this idea that Germany is now subjecting the southern states, specifically Greece, into any sort of fiscal or monetary standard, it doesn't sit well. It's not comfortable. It's, I guess you could say, an unwelcome irony.
Well, with all these conflicts, like you said, David, you've got a conflict in Greece. They remember their hyperinflation because of the Germans. The Germans remember their hyperinflations because of the Germans. But let's face it, the Deutschmark, they've been the most consistently anti-inflation because of the burn marks that they have on their body because of the past. So now what you have, you've even got Angela Merkel at this point talking about rewriting the Constitution, building more austerity and more tight controls of all the countries, but possibly to avoid the pain of inflation again.
Well, and there is this idea that if the ECB and behind it the German central bank are going to be sacrificing their balance sheets for the sake of keeping the EU together and the Eurozone together, moving forward in terms of unification, Kevin, this is really the issue. They are willing to make that sacrifice, but they want to see some controls put in place in terms of the spending of these individual constituent parts or member countries. And so, Merkel echoing what the LEAP 2020 group out of France, actually they spread across all of Europe, the think tank. We've had one of their gentlemen on our program before. If you recall, Frank Biancheri was on the program a number of months ago, and he suggested that they would be moving in the 2013 to 2014 timeframe towards a revised EU constitution. That's going to allow for a tighter framework for fiscal accountability. And again, that's all tied to integration. But there remain some real concerns over whether or not there is actual homogeneity between the northern and southern countries. And as we were discussing a few minutes ago, both Spain and Holland are now at that juncture where the question is, what language do they use? We can't meet fiscal expectations, or we won't meet fiscal expectations, as in you can go pound sand. We still are our own country.
Well, David, I think about how you talked about history moves in fits and starts, but it's almost always based on the next crisis. Okay, we talked about Europe, the crisis that we had. 1870 was a crisis when Germany first came together and defeated France. So you had a unification of Germany. 1914 to 1918 was a crisis in the European realm. 1939, to 1945, we had the same type of thing. So we see these crisis punctuations. We also see unity. I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist. I want to throw something out because people cry out for the government to do something. They're willing to you talked about a voluntary loss of sovereignty. Well, that's a huge deal over there. We see the same thing over here. We've got crisis, government intervention, bank bailouts. But let me read you a quote from Herbert Hoover, okay? He says, every collectivist revolution rides in on a Trojan horse of emergency, in quotations. It was the tactic of Lenin, Hitler, and Mussolini. In the collectivist sweep over a dozen minor countries in Europe, it was the cry of men striving to get on horseback, and, quote, emergency became the justification of the subsequent steps. This technique of creating emergency, Hoover says, is the greatest achievement that demagoguery attains. The invasion of the New Deal collectivism was introduced by the same Trojan horse. Now, when we talk to Otmar Issing, David, when we've talked to some of the people who are more involved with this European integration, a little bit of crisis doesn't seem to bother them because it seems like it's moving towards a larger goal of this one collectivist revolution that they've been talking about.
Yeah, and in fairness to our interview with Otmar Issing, it certainly was not his notion that we should be striving for or prioritizing some sort of a socialist utopia. What he was after was much more an existential calm where they could view Europe as a place where the kind of chaos that we saw in World War I and World War II would never be repeated, and that we would create so many ties of an economic nature that we could never consider harming the person who was in that category of quote-unquote other, another race, another country, another nationality, et cetera, et cetera. So there is certainly that motivation. The question is, do politicians creating their own personal legacies hijack that existential motivation and create something new? And I do think there are similarities currently in the ascent of Berlin to a politically dominant position with that of the United States, in that propelled to a greater position of control and influence has always been and continues to be this idea of crisis. Mm-hmm. Not only does crisis compress time, in some sense, you are fast forwarding to an end game or a conclusion that might have otherwise taken decades, certainly years, to develop. So you have events that speed up in a given context. And in fact, it's this crisis theory that best explains the growth of government, whether it is the U.S. Or elsewhere. Berlin is an interesting case in point as I'm here today.
Yeah, David, it's interesting. People do subject themselves to almost anything. You look at the conscription in World War I and World War II here in America. Okay, both were very politically unpopular wars, and the presidents at the time said that they were going to keep us out of the war. We still ended up in that war because people cry out. They start to realize there's an emergency. They say, do something. And so what happens is the public, what they would ordinarily not tolerate, they allow for. The problem is, once you create the mechanism, I've been using war as an example, but look at the Depression. How many social programs came under FDR and never were reversed? And so, when the public cries, do something, it reminds me, David, we've talked about this before, but as a private pilot, I'm interested in why people sometimes don't make it to their destination. And oftentimes, it's because they have this attitude of they've got to get there. Okay, pilots call it get there-itis, but that's exactly what it is. And it's sort of the same thing with people. It's like, okay, let's just get there. We don't want to see the Greeks fail. We don't want to see the American banks fail. Do it at all costs, and then we'll just reverse things once we get there.
There is this problem with not being able to maintain a sense of calm when tensions are present. If you have a question, you want the answer, and you would even press it to the point of having and accepting a wrong answer rather than waiting and working towards the right answer. So solutions or resolutions to tension are something that crowds tend to demand pretty quickly. And this is tying into that crisis theory, which is basically that extraordinary measures are easier to justify and, in fact, are often requested by the general public when circumstances become uncomfortable or out of control. This is unique because the public would ordinarily not tolerate a rapid intrusion of government into private affairs, whether that's family or business spheres. But there's this idea that if things are coming into chaos, that you just want government to do something. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think, what we're talking about, Kevin, is a further expansion of government in the wake of crisis. Again, this intolerance of intrusion into private affairs, it's voluntarily suspended, or at least it's less forcefully defended when there is the external pressure of a crisis. And in that event, you find that government ratchets up its involvement and rarely gives back the ground that it takes. And you saw that in the FDR administration. You saw that in the Truman administration. You saw that under Lyndon Johnson. So
Sure.
you have several periods, and I think you may actually have that under the Obama administration at present, or certainly in a next 4-year period, where crisis and the tools to address it and the people asking for the state apparatus to grow, to fill the gap, to resolve the tension, resolve the crisis is there. And it's exactly what we're seeing in real time here in Europe.
Well, David, I'm not a political expert, but we've talked about the markets for my lifetime. I've talked about them for about 3 decades almost. And one of the things that we do is we look at the growth trajectory or the shrinking trajectory of whatever market. We've talked about gold. The 65-week moving average for gold now for the last 10 or 11 years has been rising. Well, it almost doesn't matter what the day-to-day ups and downs are. If you just look at the 65-week moving average, it is a steady growth trajectory. I look at history through the 20th century, and now we're in the 21st century, and we're seeing government on a steady growth trajectory. I wonder, though, David, when does it happen that, the famous quote from Margaret Thatcher where she says the problem with socialism is at some point or another you run out of other people's money. How long can it last, Dave?
Well, it seems that you may be accurately calling a correlation between the growth of government. As government grows, you have that much more cash required to keep that animal or that leviathan alive. So, yeah, you certainly have to fuel the growth of government. As you are running the printing presses to do so, you'll see that reflected in real goods and services, including gold being priced higher. So you've said it exactly right, Kevin. Governments do tend to be on sort of a steady growth trajectory. Very rarely do you find them taking a step back. But like any beast, to maintain its vitality, it's going to grow. And the crisis is just one of those things that increases the rate of growth dramatically. And people are asking for it. Do something. Alleviate the pain. Take away the instability.
Sure.
Return us to the status quo, regardless of the cost. That tends to be where the growth rate accelerates for government.
What actually puts a chill in my spine, though, David, is 2 Fridays ago, the president put through an executive order reaffirming executive powers over all communication, food, water, transportation, any resources necessary. In other words, dictatorial control if he needs it. But, in the past, that presidential order would be called for when we say everybody's yelling, do something, it's a crisis. But this particular executive order doesn't really even require a crisis. So are we entering a new dimension of history making where you basically have tyrannical power whether there's a crisis or not?
Yeah, well, this is like Bush and Clinton before him. The executive powers exercisable in wartime or in the context of a crisis that is grave enough to initiate those war powers. And that could be even the healthy function of the economy.
Right.
You have President Obama who affirms those same powers, and it is, as you say, control over communication, control over food and water, control over transportation, any critical resources necessary for the healthy functioning of the economy. If any of those are compromised, then control is in place. And, Kevin, this is where we have to assume that the judiciary is on the side of the people. Unfortunately, at least in U.S. history, we've not found that to be the case. The judiciary usually stands by and for any number of years leaves those rules unchallenged. I mean, if you go back to the FDR administration, you didn't see the judiciary overturn many of the things that FDR put in place in 1933 until 1936.
Right.
Ultimately, they were found to be unconstitutional, but there was a lag time where private freedoms, individual liberties were given up for the sake of control until the judiciary rolled them back. We can only hope, and I have to emphasize hope, that the judiciary would do something similar if and as and when we saw the executive office overstepping constitutional boundaries.
Well, I think sometimes, David, we have to go back and look at what it is that we have lost for this collectivism, okay? And I'll admit, I'm 49 years old, so I've not lived during a period of time where we really had true rule of law, true private property protection. The things that 100 years before were protected to the last breath of a lot of the legislature and a lot of the politicians even at the time. I think of Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland, even though every politician has to do things that are in their best interest to get reelected, there were a few things that these guys back then just never did. It was almost a gentleman's agreement. You don't go back on the rule of law. you don't go back on private property. And it seems at this point, I mean, you're in Europe right now. We saw the Greek situation. All they had to do was call it a default, because that's what it was, so that these guys would get paid on their CDSs, and that would have, the markets would have balanced out a default. Instead, they just confiscated 73% of the value of those bonds for the private holder, and they almost put a gun to these people's heads and said, look, this isn't a default, is it? And private property rights were out the window. We see the same thing here in America with the bailouts that we have here. So contrast for me for a moment, David, the change in the belief systems. Do people even really realize what it is that we're missing at this point?
Well, I do think that the enforcement of the collective action clauses and the ISDA's determination that there was a default there at the tail end, it's more of a subnote, but it did reaffirm that the contract law is still important. And the financial markets, you would see, come unwound. You would go through even a greater period of capital deformation if, in fact, we had fully stepped away from the rule of law. But I think as you look back in time, what you do see is that rule of law, private property rights, and public peace, a priority for most politicians. You now have them focusing on the last one instead of the first two. Public peace, tranquility, a sense of well-being, rather than private property rights and the rule of law. Those first two tend to be more expendable.
Well, David, you had mentioned that the court system was our protection from a government that would redistribute our wealth, okay, and that hasn't necessarily been protected at this point. In fact, I'm going to read a quote from a great book, Crisis and Leviathan, that you put me onto, written by Robert Higgs, and one of the things that he talks about is this plunder, this legal plunder, or this redistribution, or not paying attention to the first two, like you said, rule of law or private property, to maintain public peace. Now, what we have going on with the Supreme Court right now, before I read this quote, is they're hearing arguments about the health bill. Now, it's going to be interesting to see where they land, if they're going to land on just a redistribution, give everybody health care, or if they're going to actually look at the rule of law and private property rights and whether it is indeed constitutional that they force everyone to buy insurance. Now, here's the quote from the Higgs book. It says, among the most significant of such adjustments of big government is the Supreme Court's consistent refusal to protect individual rights from invasion by governmental officials during national emergencies. Okay, precedents are established each time there's an emergency, and more the Constitution seems to be less and less.
There is a lot that hangs in the balance with the determination this week by the Supreme Court as to the constitutionality of the health care bill, because it will either tame the tendency of government to grow leaps and bounds in the next 4 years or inspire it. And I think that if you give an inch, a yard will certainly be taken in the next 4 years. Obama will be very emboldened. And I think it is fair to say, Kevin, that at this point he is the shoe-in. This is an interesting commentary. Got to spend some time with folks that advise in Washington, various political parties, specifically in the Republican camp. And fascinating to know that Romney is considered the person who won the primaries and is the weakest of contenders, almost another John McCain, by the elite in Washington. He's outspent his competition. Romney has from sevenfold at a minimum to as much as 55-fold and is barely winning. So how will he do against the incumbent? And the assumption is good luck. So those in Washington who favor sort of the Republican side of things see Obama as a shoo-in. So again, you cycle back around to the health care issue, and this either emboldens Obama over the next 4 years or tempers him even slightly. And so what we see happen this week may tell us a lot about the next 4 years, what they look like and what they feel like, and what we experience as citizens who care about private property, who care about private initiative, who care about entrepreneurship, who care about the capital markets and normal, healthy functioning in those markets.
Well, and I think we're going to have to wait just a little bit to know what the final decision is, because I think they're thinking that'll come out in July sometime. But, you know, what you're talking about with Obama, he's already talking to other leaders worldwide in sort of past tense. You know, the quote this week that everyone heard, the mic was on and Obama basically asked Medvedev for some space, you know, till after his election. So I think he's a long-term planner, you know, and 8 years is his plan.
Well, Kevin, being here in Germany, sort of the seat of feudalism, if you look at the number of castles that are in the countryside, you realize that with all the different city-states going back many centuries, this is a place that has practiced what we are likely to experience more and more of in the United States, a loss of freedom and a loss of individual autonomy, as we live out the New Deal ideal of a mixed economy where there's command economy, if you will, with those characteristics of capitalism. Unfortunately, it sounds like recalling a conversation we've had with others who've described China in just those words, a command economy with characteristics of capitalism. But that is largely what we move toward in this sort of mixed economy where government is growing larger and larger.
Well, and I think, David, it's interesting that you bring up feudalism. I think of the quote from Alvin Goldner. He says that any society that entails the strengthening of the state apparatus by giving unchecked control over the economy and reunites the political and the economic is truly a historical regression. In it, there's no more future for the public or the freedoms it supported than there was under feudalism. So he's comparing this mixed economy with feudalism as well. And you're in the land of castles, David. Anytime a person drives through Germany, every few miles you see this old, broken-down castle. Well, a lot of people don't realize that's the statement of the political economy in Europe more than it has been any other type of political system.
Well, as we wrap up, I think we should drill down on a particular financial implication, because as we see the public sector growing, the problem is that the private sector simply won't be able to support the cash flow needs of this monster. And so what you should expect and what you should look for is weakness in the dollar. What you should expect and what you should look for is weakness in the Treasury market. And we'll be taking note of that as and when it occurs. But, Kevin, that's essentially the problem, is there's not enough money. Margaret Thatcher's old phrase, there's not enough money to go around. Socialism begins to show its weakness when you run out of other people's money. We're at that tipping point, a tipping point where, as a percentage of the total employed persons in America, as a percentage of gross national product, we're seeing government get to the point where it simply doesn't work. Just like you can have a demographic winter where you don't have enough workers supporting a retired class, you're now talking about the public sector in that same sort of vein getting to the point where it cannot be supported by private sector taxation. So we will look for the very unfortunate and dire consequences in the dollar and Treasury market. And we think that that's really crisis point of 2013, 2014 within those markets, if not sooner.
Which seems to always end in inflation, the printing of money, when you no longer can afford to pay the people through the government, the bread and circuses, you have to print money. So I guess this goes right back to our discussion on gold. It's still worth holding on to real gold while the paper goes away, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a very important thing. When you're watching this sort of ratcheting up of government largesse, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the 1930s, and the economic crisis that we saw there, just those examples, Kevin, these are periods of stress and strain, both in the currency markets and the financial markets in general. And there is a time frame in which you simply want to be out of the fray, to reemerge another day, to reengage another day in productive assets like stocks and bonds and real estate. But in this timeout period where government grows and there is regulatory uncertainty and tax uncertainty, that is a period of time where the risks in the marketplace are not justified by the rewards, and people should be moving to the sidelines. Precious metals have been the standard for that going back hundreds of years. Germany is one of those places where you see that as a tradition, as a historic tradition. Families have always kept a part of their wealth positioned in gold.
You've been listening to the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. I'm Kevin Orrick along with David McAlvany. You can find us at McAlvany.com, McAlvany.com, or give us a call at 800-525-9556.
This has been the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. The views expressed should not be considered to be a solicitation or a recommendation for your investment portfolio. You should consult a professional financial advisor to assess your suitability for risk and investment. Join us again next week for a new edition of the McAlvany Weekly Commentary.